Welcome to today's webinar. We are going to be talking about contractors, overtime, and other recent employment compliance changes. Thank you so much for taking some time out of your day to join us. I am Hannah Hood. I am going to be our facilitator today. I am a virtual CFO here with Summit Virtual CFO by Anders, and I'm also a senior resource manager. I am joined today by John Baldino. I'll let him tell you a little bit more about himself in just a bit, but I'm going to take care of a few housekeeping items before we get started. You're welcome to drop any questions in the Q&A or the chat. I'll be monitoring both as we go, and we will certainly try to get any of your questions answered live while we are on this recording. And if you're watching the recording back, certainly feel free to email in any questions, or if you're watching via our post on YouTube, you can certainly drop those in the comments as well. So that being said, I want to give you all a little bit of background about who we are as a firm. In 2002, Summit was started by Jody Grundon and Adam Hale, who you see here in our very first picture, respectively. We started as a traditional CPA firm. We did taxes, audit, things of that nature. And then in 2004, we started offering CFO and back office accounting services, really before we started to see the industry shift to this more of an advisory focused lens that we see a lot of accounting industries starting to shift to. In 2013, we became a fully distributed firm, well ahead of the remote working wave. So we've kind of been ahead of the curve a bit, and so that's been fun to be a part of. In 2022, Summit joined Anders CPAs and Advisors. They are a traditional CPA firm based out of St. Louis, Missouri. And so now we have rebranded ourselves as Summit Virtual CFO by Anders. And so we have our team that works in St. Louis, but we also still have a fully distributed team, one of which that I'm a part of. I'm actually in Tupelo, Mississippi. So I'm really glad to have y'all. And that's just a little bit about who we are as a firm. And then, like I said, I am joined by John, who is the president of Humoristo. And so I'd love, John, for you to tell us a little bit more about yourself. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Hannah, for having me. Appreciate it. Good afternoon, good morning, depending upon where you are. I'm glad that you're here. Again, I'm John Baldino. I am the president and founder of Humoristo, which is an HR consulting firm. The bulk of our work really is US based. We have some global clientele and needs that we help meet as well. But again, the bulk of it being US based. And so the topic that we'll be able to talk about today really is going to focus in on that US-based perspective in some of the legislative changes that have gone on. A couple things as we get started here. First, like Hannah said, if you have a question, if there's something that comes up, please feel free to pop that into the Q&A or chat. We will be keeping an eye on that. But please know, too, that some of the situations you may bring up in your questions are really nuanced. And so we might have a hard time giving an answer just in a quick one-liner right back in the chat to you. My contact information will be here, will be displayed towards the end of the presentation. So please feel free to reach out to Humoristo as well if there's something more specific. And you're also going to notice something that is a big no-no as far as I'm concerned when it comes to presentation, and that is the slides will have, some of them in particular, will have lots of information on them. And so the reason for that is because I've tried to make sure from a resource standpoint, you have some of the prescriptive components of the legislation and the way in which the law is to be enacted. I'm not going to read through those slides. Please don't worry if you see a bunch of text on a slide that I'm going to read it all to you. I won't, but it will be available to you not only obviously during this session, but you'll actually also be able to access this after the fact. And so I want you to be able to have those slides to be able to refer to some of those areas of legislation. And I think that's it as far as my housekeeping is concerned. So for those of you who have been involved with the HR world for a while, you know that there is nothing like a good legislative change to get the blood going, right? There is just this January 1st-ness that we used to have, right? What's going to change? And that for someone like me who's been doing this work for 30 plus years, was really easy in some ways to schedule. I knew when the law was going to change. Coming into a new calendar year was a guarantee that something somewhere was going to update or expand, if not be completely new. Well, where we find ourselves now, fast forward 30 plus years, is legislative changes happen all the time. Random dates. While we're not going to cover this in this particular session, next in the next couple of weeks, in the middle of the week in September, the non-compete sunsetting for most will occur. So it's just random anymore in terms of when these things go active. So the onus is really on us as business leaders, management, HR practitioners to really be up on what is taking place when. And one of the things that I know has been sort of difficult for some organizations has to do with some of these Fair Labor Standards changes that have already been enacted. And for those who are not super familiar with it, this is the part of the government that oversees the way in which people are paid ultimately. Are individuals entitled to overtime? Is the classification of the job one where it should be offered or shouldn't be offered? And so we're going to talk a little bit about some of those changes. I do want to recognize as well that the last changes were made in 2021, so not that long ago. But this go round has been much more significant than what went on in 2021. And in fact, some of what has been put into place now overrides what had been done in 2021. And we're going to see some leaning into contractors as part of that, as well as some very distinct implications for business. So if you're part of a finance team, and I'm so glad to get to partner today, because for Summit, there's a lot of help from a financial standpoint that they're going to be able to help provide based on this as you look at forecasting and budgeting and some tax implications as well. Bear in mind that when you misclassify someone and the government catches it, I'll do my very best they don't just look at you and say, fix that. Let's make sure that it's working the way that it should moving forward. What they say is, and here's how many years you owe in back taxes and in fines and penalties, right? So if you've employed someone incorrectly for a couple of years in terms of eligibility for overtime, you may have to pay that back, plus fines and penalties, right? And so some jurisdictions, even from a state and city standpoint, are layered on top of that as well. So lots to be considered of when we look at these changes. So let me set the table when it comes to the way in which I'm using these terms overtime or exemption. Let me tell you how that works. The way that it works is there are jobs that are eligible to be exempt from overtime. They're not exempt from pay. There are no jobs that are exempt from pay. Let me just make sure I tell you that. That means, bartering, that sort of stuff, right? Because there's still a taxation connected to that, which could be circumvented. So the government wants to see you pay people. But they give you 3 areas of consideration to determine whether that particular role, not the person, but the role is either eligible or not eligible for overtime. And these are the 3 areas: salary basis, salary threshold, and job duties. And very simply, salary basis is how often is pay being offered in a salaried context, right? If someone is hourly, that may very well mean that they need to be paid overtime. Even if you say, well, John, I give them 40 hours every week and they make the same hourly rate, so it pretty much is the same. Well, if it pretty much is the same, then it should be salary. If it's not, then it is going to be looked at with a bit more scrutiny. So if you're paying somebody salary, that's one thing. And I'm going to stop there for a second to say, through the years, and some of you probably here have heard this, that just because you pay someone's salary does not mean that they're not eligible for overtime. Does not mean that their role wouldn't be eligible for overtime. So you would still have to track their time. They'd have a baseline of the first 40 hours being this flat salary piece that you have in place. But then if they go over that, how are we tracking and then accruing what overtime payment would be for that person? So please don't think just because you pay someone's salary that they are exempt from overtime. They're not the same
Now,
thing.
is that applicable to every industry, or are
Every
there?
industry.
Okay, that's good to know.
Every industry, yeah. So you want to be thoughtful about that. Now, there can be some considerations in very, very, very technical computer related work, for instance, where you can do an hourly rate for someone, but narrow is the bucket for something like that. On the salary threshold level, that's going to be something we're going to spend a little bit of time on. And what the threshold is a minimum. You must pay someone not only a salary, but a salary that is no less than this particular number. And that particular number can be annualized, but often the law puts it forward as if it's a weekly amount. And obviously, you just take that number and multiply it by 52 to give you the sense of what that annualized salary would be. That threshold has to be met. And what we're going to see in a moment is that in the last change to legislation has had 2 changes passed for that threshold. And it's pretty significant, particularly the second one. And then lastly, this is an area that I couldn't emphasize anymore but by saying you may need another set of eyes to help you here, is the job duties test. Does the work that the person is doing meet a standard that the government has determined to be allowable for an exemption to overtime? It's very, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit later, but it is very specific in terms of what that job duties test is. So to be clear, just because you pay someone regularly on salary, just because you may pay someone, I'll say $100,000 a year in salary, it's not a Meatloaf song. It's not 2 out of 3 ain't bad, right? That job duties test has to be met as well. To just lean on the first 2 does not protect you from the consideration that that role may be eligible for overtime. So those are the 3, it's like a 3-legged stool. All 3 of those things have to be in place for a particular role to meet the potential of exemption from overtime. So let me get into the weeds with the threshold bit that I started to mention. This is representative of some of the recent changes that have occurred. So before July 1st, so we're talking a month and a half ago, there was the first change that was put through. Before July 1st, the number that was used by the government was $684 a week, which, as you can see here, about $35,568 a year in terms of annual salary. Again, what that means for exemption is someone in a salary-based role where the role met the job duties test had to make at least $35,568 a year in order to potentially be exempt from overtime. As of July 1st, so if this is news for some of you, good morning. It's 6 weeks later. It's not too late, but good morning, right? July 1st of this year, we saw a jump to $844 a week. This is $43,888 a year. Now, let me say a couple of things about that. First, yes, it's about 8,000 and change higher than where it was. But if you think about a lot of the roles that you have at your organization, those that are on salary is where I'm going to ask you to focus for the moment. Those on salary right now, and you look at that number, there's a good chance, not an exclusive chance, but a good chance that you may already have been paying people over that 43.8 threshold. You may say, gosh, I looked at our payroll report, and the lowest person in our particular organization on salary is making $45,000. We didn't have to do anything for July 1st because we met at least this portion of the salary threshold change. You'd be right. That part didn't need to have any change. But the other thing to be thoughtful of is some of you are operating, and this is the blessing and curse of a distributed workforce. Some of you are staffing individuals who are doing the same jobs, but from different places across the country, even over the river from one state to the next. Uh-oh, here comes the next hard one. Even across the street within a city jurisdiction and crossing the street over into a suburban jurisdiction where there are cities with specifics around what a salary threshold should be. And for the sake of time, because none of you would ever listen or like me if I were to go through it all, think New York City. There's a very specific salary threshold that has been in place well before the pandemic, just to give you a frame of reference. And these numbers already have been surpassed by what New York City requires for there to be consideration for exemption. Is a city allowed to do something more than the state or more than the federal government? You're darn right they can. What the federal government would say is it can't be any worse than what we require, but it can always be better. It can never be worse, but it can always be better. So I want to make sure that you know this doesn't mean if you have to meet a city threshold that you now are given the opportunity here to reduce that in order to meet the federal. Nope, you'd be out of compliance with your city or your state requirement. But what you see in that third bullet point, and if you are in a place where you might have a drink or a smoke, I know this may be important because this is a bigger jump.
Mm-hmm.
As of January 1st, this January 1st, 2025, that threshold is increased to $1,128 per week, which is $58,656 a year. You're talking about almost $15,000 more per year than the change just made on July 1st. Pretty significant.
That is pretty significant.
Right, Hannah? Like
Yeah.
super significant. And
Yeah.
because if you think about some of the organizations I know that you get to help support, if you've got a layer of, I'll say entry or mid-level management or specialized skill, professional roles, technical roles, whatever level it might be, that could be a whole lot of people that need to be raised to a minimum.
Sure. And we start our budgeting conversations for 2025 in October, typically, in October and November, we're heavy in those conversations. So we obviously, this is important for us to look at and take into consideration, because if we don't, and then we get to January the 1st, and then we have to make that adjustment to our budget, it's not going to feel very good to have to make concessions other places to still hit our targets for where we want to hit, versus if we're having that conversation now, we can understand and see the full picture of the implications that it's going to have and make some decisions that are based on rationale, not based on emotion, because we've gotten there and now we realize we had to do this and we're panicking. So a question for the audience that y'all are welcome to put into the chat if you want to. I just wanted to know, like, how many of y'all have started already evaluating your team's salary in light of these new thresholds? Like, just give us an idea if you have. If you haven't, that's totally fine. But I'd love to hear if anybody's already started looking at that.
I cheated to see a bunch of the people that are here listening live, and I know already there's a couple that are wonderful, and I know they're going to say yes in the chat that they've already started because I know them. But you're absolutely, what you just said is spot on. And it is really difficult to have a budgetary discussion if you're not apprised of things that are outside of your control. And this is outside of a business control. There's nothing a business is going to do now to say, I don't like this July 1st thing. I want to fight that. There's nowhere for you to go. It is in place. And at this moment, there are no injunctions to stop what's planned for January 1st from happening. Now, I do want to make sure that I say, is that possible? Of course. Up until December 31st, it's possible. But it's really hard to decide to do a budget on December 31st.
Oh, please don't. Please don't. Please don't do that to yourself.
You are going to start ahead of that.
That's right.
I want to make sure that everybody just takes a breath, because one of the other things that Hannah mentioned is there is an emotional component to this. If you are a small to medium-sized business owner and you're putting together financial considerations for your entire staff, you now are faced potentially with decisions of staff reduction to cover some of the costs that you may have to outlay now. You may even decide to discontinue or sunset some verticals, service or product offerings that you may have because you're just trying to make ends meet. There are significant decisions that may have to be made as a result of this kind of change. But I want to be really practical too. And so what I'm sharing here is a slide that has tinier font. So for those of you like me who wear prescription glasses and find yourself needing to update that prescription almost yearly at this point, I know what this looks like. As I said to you, I want you to be able to access it after the fact to study. But let me just kind of walk through briefly really a perspective that I know Hannah and her team will be pushing for as well with the clients that they're supporting. If I just look at someone who, and I just want to use simple numbers because I just think it's easier, right? So if at the beginning of this year, we had somebody in January, February, March, who was hired at $40,000 a year. By the time July 1st came around for this year, we were required to have a minimum consideration, right, for that person. Remember, as I just showed you, it had jumped up, and I'll go back just to remind everybody, it had gone up to $43,888 a year. So if you have somebody at 40,000, you're looking at $3,888 at least, right, to help get them to that minimum threshold. But what you really want to do is kind of sit and do some analysis with it. So if you take that 40,000 a year and divide it by 2080, which is full-time hours for the year, 52 times 40 hours a week, that gives you an hourly rate of $19.23. If you know that, and I use Jim, poor Jim, if Jim works 45 hours a week on average, I'm now considering 5 hours of overtime because his role may not meet the exemption. If I take 5 hours times that 1923, right? I'm sorry, 5 hours times time and a half of that 1923, which is the 2885, you can see on that third bullet point that if I just kind of worked with what I know about Jim, I'm doing that would cost me $913.45, keeping him at the 40,000, paying 5 hours of overtime each week. That's what that weekly number would average, $913.45. But if I just did the new minimum threshold and he meets the exemption, that's only $844 weekly. I'm better off. It would save the company just to move him up that 3,800 and change, that it would to keep him right on salary at the exemption level and not have to worry about overtime. I would wind up saving money as the business. I would save money. But now, poor Jim, come January 1st, in that next scenario, if we had raised him, remember, to the 43,888 that we did for July 1st, his hourly rate is now 2110, using the same math as we did above, and overtime rate is 3165. If we still work from those 45 hours, Jim would be at $1,002.25 per week, as opposed to 1128 if we raise his salary to that 56 and change. Now the company may have to go back to Jim and say, I know what we did for July 1st was bump your salary. What we're going to do for January 1st is convert you to hourly. We're going to have you punch in and out.
I have a question about this.
There's a lot of questions with that.
What
Please.
if I'm Jim and I'm doing the math on this and I'm like, wait a minute, it would benefit me more to stay hourly in the initial bump. Like, have you foreseen employers like getting pushback on that in terms of the employees kind of doing their own math and seeing where, it would just, they feel like they'd be better off being hourly?
It's a very good question. I'm going to say it's a little bit of a mixed bag in terms of whether I'm seeing a lot of math being done or not from the employee level. What I find to be actually brought up much more is that there is a definite sense of, if I go from salary to hourly, um, the cachet affects me.
Hmm.
I don't like feeling that I'm an hourly employee. It makes me feel like I'm entry level when I've grown in my skill set and I'm sitting in a position that I feel like is more advanced. Why would I take a perceived step back into an hourly role from salary? That is a very interesting nuance that we don't talk much about, but from the individual employee standpoint, they feel some sort of way about it. I don't want to be
Sure.
bothered with tracking my time, clocking in and out, clocking out. Now I have to clock out for lunch and back in for lunch now. I'm back to that kind of existence. And I don't like the way that that feels. That has come up, I would say, more because
Hmm.
individual employees just don't like how that feels.
Sure.
Now, if you're a business owner, it's important to know that you're at the end of the day, your employees don't get to tell you, well, I want to be hourly, well, I want to be salary, right? It's still the company's decision. I would always recommend there being as much transparency as possible in a conversation with your team, right? You don't want this to become unnecessarily divisive. Remember, both you and your employee are dealing with legislation that ultimately has been imposed upon you both. And now you're trying to make sense of how to approach it. And we're also going to see that a little bit more when we talk about the contractor changes connected here as well. And so this is impositional, and I don't mean that to
Hmm.
say that the government is horrible, although I know some people feel that way and I get it, but that I'm now having to live in what I've been mandated to live by. What I would say to you is, and again, from a financial standpoint, love that I'm getting the chat with the folks from Summit today, right? And Hannah being here, because these are the things that really, from a financial standpoint, the wisdom coming from a support structure that's outside of the emotional component of it to say, let's run some analysis. Let's
Hmm.
look at the staff that you have now. Who would have to be changed? How much would that cost? What's the difference between hourly and salary? And to the exact thing, Hannah, that you're saying, there will be organizations, I know it, who will say, you know what? I know I'll save a little bit of money if I, like in this instance with Jim, if I convert Jim to hourly, we will wind up saving some money for January 1st. That's true. Is it worth $100 a week for me to really irritate Jim and affect his heartbeat for the organization? I might say it's worth $100 a week for me not to do that to him. And so I'm not.
Sure.
I'm going to just bump his salary. That may be a decision that a business owner or a leadership team may make, but they need to
Sure.
do it with real numbers.
Well, and another consideration in this are your benefits that you pay
Yeah.
for employees that you would layer
Yeah.
onto this as well in terms of you have your base salary but in terms of the actual expense to the company is a
Yes.
layer that you need to consider in each situation as well because
Yeah.
when you tack that on, you may end up being better off keeping somebody at
Absolutely.
hourly or vice
Absolutely.
versa, like whatever that
Absolutely.
math ends up being. So it
Yep.
really is a multi-layered analysis that has to happen in order to paint the full picture for the
And
decision
it's a
that needs to be
great
made.
thing that you bring up, Hannah, because I want to make sure with clarity, right? Because I know we'll have some people watching this after the fact as well. Um, uh, Nothing that you do supplemental benefits or any other kind of ancillary benefit or perk that you provide. This is about base salary. So
Right.
you have to be thoughtful to these rules being just about base. If you want to sit and say, yeah, but I'll throw so and so a bonus like that. First of all, you have to be really careful about the way in which you're leaning into your bonus or incentive-based programs, right? That's a whole other seminar. But for this is base salary. That's what we're talking about here, base salary.
Mhm.
There are, again, roles that have some consideration, but it is super narrow. And it is not up to the employer to say, oh my gosh, this so and so, she's a gem. She could do 10 jobs. she's fantastic. She is a bit of a unicorn. And so she has to be exempt because she's so good at so many things. That's not the way the law works. What is the role that she has? Don't
Mhm.
tell me what she's doing that's outside of the role, right? We know we have people like that sometimes in our organizations that they've got one job on paper, but they're really doing two and a half, right? You've
Sure.
got to be really clear because one of the things, and I'll talk about this in a few minutes, one of the things that's going to be looked at are your job descriptions. And just
Mhm.
because Hannah is phenomenal and Hannah does two and a half jobs, but she has one job description that's really connected to her work, and that role doesn't meet the exemption thresholds across the board, it doesn't matter. It
Mhm.
doesn't matter, right? They're going to look at it for the role that she has.
That's right. So we have a question that came into the
Sure.
chat that I think this is a good time to cover this. So the question is, are companies opting to cap their impacted employees at 40 hours if possible to avoid any inadvertent noncompliance?
I love that. I love that somebody brought that up, right? First thing I'll say is good luck. Um, who's managing that? So when Hannah gets into work and Hannah needs to be ready for work at 9 a.m. Poor Hannah, I'm just going to pick on you. It seems like the
Do
whole
it.
time.
That's great.
Hannah has to be ready for work at 9 a.m. And so Hannah clocks in at 5 of. And at the end of the week, you might say, well, that's only like, 8 minutes of overtime past the 40 hours. We're not so worried about that. Okay, I'm not saying you should be, but but that has to be tracked nonetheless. The government has to see that you've done it. And if you have timekeeping systems that lock, you have to be really, really careful about that. We won't let anybody clock out after 5 p.m. or 5:03 p.m. That's it. Well, what happens when Hannah works until 5:20 because she got a phone call from a client and it went till 5:20? Well, we'll just tell her to leave 20 minutes earlier on Friday. Who's tracking that? Who's now you want HR or your finance team in some organizations to run around and keep up with that. And the one thing that is always going to be difficult is when we get into the manual changing of timesheets.
Mhm.
The Department of Labor adores the manual changing of timesheets. You wonder why they adore it? It's really tough for you to defend it. And so if there's a complaint, they're looking for that, right? It's like, well, I did this, we worked this out, this is what I told the person. And when that employee says, you never told me any of those things you just said, the Department of Labor is not going to find in your favor as the employer. I'm sorry to say it. They're not, because it's tough to be able to prove that narrative. So I appreciate, by the way, I want to make sure I say I do appreciate and understand the 40 hour. If you really can enforce it cleanly across the board without any undue impact or disparate impact to any particular people group or type, it may be that Fridays you take, Friday mornings, you look at everybody's time card, so to speak, for the week, and you're like, honey, you got to leave by noon today. You've already put in X amount of hours, so you're done at noon today. That may
Mhm.
be a route to go as well.
Mhm. That's great. Thanks for answering that.
Of course. So I hopefully this gives you a sense of two things. One, there's real money involved here. This is not what some of us have gotten used to, let's say, with some legislation where it's like, make sure this poster is hung up. I know that's important. Or make sure that you add this to your onboarding documentation. I get that. But this is really something that is financially impactful. The other piece that I said I would touch on that has also changed this year is really the view of contractor and employee. And so let me take a step back just briefly to say in 2021, we saw a streamlining of the approach to how do I know if someone's an employee? And it seemed really simple. And I'm not here to say that whether that's right or wrong. I'm just saying that it was simplistic in its approach. What we now have that was put into place this year is a little more robust. It's actually 6 points of consideration. And so I'm going to briefly walk through these, but what I'm going to say to you is this. Please don't look at this as, well, I got 5 out of 6 good with this person. So if I'm only falling down on the one, I'm okay. No. the law, they were very clear to say this is not about anyone having precedence or predominance over another. If there's a chance that we feel like the one area you're not compliant in is enough to swing someone, let's say from a contractor to an employee, we reserve the right to do so based off of that one thing. Now, this is a recorded call. I know that my career in some ways is on the line. I'm going to just say there is a reasonability to it as well. Do I know what that is? Not yet. We don't have enough lawsuits, believe it or not, in this area yet. There's a couple that have been filed, and the ways in which the courts decide those will help us to understand how they may interpret and then rule on some of these things. But as we look at this, especially for those of you that use freelancers, those of you that use individuals for project-based type work, really be thoughtful about some of these things that I'm going to just mention in these 6 areas. One, what is the profit and loss opportunity? And what that means is how much weight does this person that you're using as a contractor have to the financial success for the organization? If they carry a lot in terms of affecting profit significantly or affecting loss significantly, and I'm going to stop myself and say, what does significantly mean? I don't know. I was
going to ask that question. Define significantly.
I don't know. That's part of the way that case law might help us then once courts decide on some things. I would say to you, though, if you think about it, at the very least, I can say this. If it winds up meaning that you would have to lay some people off as a result of a loss incurred by this person's either poor work, or if they left their contractor support of your company and it wound up significantly affecting your organization in staffing, in liabilities, in the increase of perhaps line of credit application that you're taking on more debt, I would think those are going to be some of the things that'll be looked at as far as case law is concerned to prove this was pretty significant. So think about that. The financial stake of any resource from the worker, what that means is the way in which they're doing their work dependent upon investment that individual's made into their area of expertise? Is that photographer? Pick that example. Is it their cameras? They've bought all the lenses, the software that they use, whatever is it theirs? Or are they leaning on what the company has purchased in order to do that work? Who has put the financial stake into the work? And so, you might say, well, gosh, John, we've got this amazing lab at our facility that we're happy to let the photographers use because we have it. We used to have some in-house people. We don't anymore. We've gotten back into the work and now we've got them using it. I hear you. I get you. It sounds very reasonable to me. Is that an area that will be looked at? Should there be a reason to try to determine if this person's an employee or not? It will be, nonetheless. It will be nonetheless. Permanence is such a fascinating one for me. I cannot wait for the courts to decide this one in particular for me. So I have family members. My wife's brother, for instance, has worked as a contractor for Johnson & Johnson off and on for years. For years. Well, what does permanence mean? He's done this for years as an independent contractor, right? Or sometimes part of a small group of people who come into J&J and do some contractual work. What's permanence? Well, I think what they're going to look at here is first and foremost going to be about an individual. And the reason I'm saying that is because if it's a vendor, right, a third-party vendor that you're bringing in, that's a handful of people that are doing that kind of project work, like the kind of organization that I run, an HR consulting firm. It's more than one person. There's a team of people coming in to provide support. That's probably a little different than an individual. And by the way, an individual who owns an LLC is still an individual. And they were very specific about that in this law. It used to be that we would say, just form an LLC. If we pay the LLC and don't use your name for the LLC, right? If we use the LLC, then it won't give the appearance of They have already been very clear and mildly threatening to say they'll be pulling the articles of incorporation to see how many people are involved with this thing and who's doing the work. And if it's solo practitioner, that may be a consideration in permanence. How long have you had this ultimately individual contributor as a contractor involved with your organization? Keep in mind, part of the reason they're leaning on this is because if Hannah is an independent contractor and she's been doing work at an organization for 3 years, that's 3 years where she has been denied access to health benefits, ancillary benefits, the ability to participate in a retirement plan, which for some of you, has now become legislative in nature in some parts of the country where you're required to offer some sort of retirement level plan. Sick time accrual, all that stuff Hannah loses out on because she wasn't an employee. That's why they care about this permanence bit.
So I know
Good.
just
I'm sorry,
enough
Hannah.
about this to be dangerous. If I'm being honest, I'm prefacing this next question with that statement for that reason. I feel like I've seen some literature about contractors and the work that they do for one individual company, and there being some consideration for if they are open to work for other
Yes.
organizations or if
Yes.
they are only working for and dedicating their time to a specific contract for a
You're
length
not
of
being
time.
dangerous at all. That's the
Okay, good.
perfect lead into this, to the next point, which is
Okay,
the
great.
control. Perfect segue. Thank you very
Good.
much. To Hannah's point, right? What's the degree of control that the employer, the company, has over that individual? That's also going to lean into their permission to do other work. To exactly, Hannah, to your point. Am I an independent contractor who, is a graphic designer and I do it for a few different clients? Yeah, that's good. You want that. That's a
Mhm.
better look that the person is more of an independent contractor. If they have to, whoever the person is, if they primarily work for you, you allow them to work for other companies as well, but they have to run it by you before they can say yes to an outside job, um, that might be a problem. And I say that because I do know that that's in some of the contracts for some independent contractors, some of the agreements where it's like, look, we reserve the right because we want to make sure you're not working for a competitor, or providing similar work that we may have paid for from an intellectual property standpoint that you're now going to use in support of another company. I appreciate all the legalese of that. I'm talking to you about the way in which the government, federal government, will look at it. They're not going to really care too much about that. They're going to say you did not allow this person to take a particular job because you felt it might violate some of these other things. That sounds like you're exercising control over them. And that's what they'll be looking for. Um,
Mhm.
Fifth point is the essentialness consideration. Is the work that the individual is doing, this contractor doing, essential to the employer's business? And what we mean by that is, it's not to say that it isn't essential in the sense of it's like core to what you do, right? If it's a medical organization and you're providing medical support, um, okay, we get that. But how deeply integral is it to the business itself? If this independent contractor, and we see this in medical as one example, if you've built an entire weight loss program around a primary doctor who you're categorizing as an independent contractor. And so now you have nurse practitioners and nurses' aides and other levels of medical practitioners that are now involved in this practice that are employees, but this doctor remains an independent contractor. It could be that if that doctor goes and leaves, everything falls apart. It may be, and again, the degree of work is still yet to be decided in the courts, that is something where this could be looked at as, hey, they're essential. You didn't have a business now without that individual person. That's a telltale sign, at least potentially.
Mhm.
And then lastly, how much skill and initiative. And again, this is also a little bit about control. So do I tell the person how to do the work that I've hired them to do? the hours that they are to do the work that I've hired them to do? That do I provide so much direction that they aren't able to operate independently? That sure sounds like I'm managing an employee. And so that is going to be a problem for the independent contractor. Now, that is not to say that you don't say to like you would hire any vendor, this is our end goal. Here's the project we're looking to have completed. Do you have a plan of attack for this? That you're now leaning on their expertise. You're not telling them how it has to get done. You're leaning on their expertise. That's the difference as we look at this, right? From contractor to employee. And again, I just walked through those 6 considerations to give you a sense of what you have to look at. It is absolutely worthwhile for you in 2 ways. One, to lean into your HR team or department of one or consultative support, whatever it is you have, to maybe sit and look at these duties and responsibilities for some of the independent contractors. Are they starting to smell like an employee? What should we do about that? Should there be some changes made? We want to keep them an independent contractor. What might we have to do to affirm that? It may be now also that you need to sit with finance and make a determination about how we go to bid for contractual support. Do we lean on organizations maybe that are more vendor oriented than individual? By the way, I'm not trying to keep individuals from getting work. That's not what I mean. Fiverr wouldn't exist without that, right? And those of you who are familiar with a website like Fiverr, you're talking about individuals who are doing one-off projects, sometimes a couple of projects a year for someone, but they're doing them for multiple people or multiple organizations. That's still going to fit within the independent contractor moniker. You don't need to worry that that person is going to somehow jeopardize your organization. That I wouldn't worry about. But it's worth you sitting and looking to say, what is our process to determine how do we put out a RFP? Do we do things like that? What are the ways in which we're trying to affirm the fact that we are seeking transparency in how we bring in independent contractors?
So I have a scenario that's come in the
Please.
chat that
Yeah.
this is a great opportunity to talk about this right here. All right, so we leverage quite a few contractors now as a digital agency, so professional services, in an
Yeah.
attempt to maintain a more flexible resourcing strategy until it's clear a full-time hire is necessary in any given area. Good for you. Like, that's great. That is what I encourage my clients to do. I would say that all of our contractors meet these criteria as contractors, but there are a couple of situations where we ask them to come into our office in line with our hybrid schedule, as the work is often more efficient in person. Other than that, they have plenty of control over how they work, but should this request be in person on some days be a concern for us?
Yes, is my answer.
Oh, good. Glad that was asked
Yes.
here. Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate a
Yeah.
little bit
Yeah,
on why
sure.
that should be in place?
Anytime that you're exercising control, not only how work is being done, but when and where work is done, that starts to smell like an employee. And if, by the way, I know what was just said, and we're amongst friends here, right? So we're safe.
Of course.
Um, Even the way in which you put that together, I hear a Department of Labor auditor saying, so is that an introductory period? You're seeing if their work is going to be decent enough or if the need is great enough. And so you hire them to see and then hopefully convert them to an employee. Is that what you just described to me? That sounds like temp, not contractor. That sounds like
Mhm.
temp. And temp is an employee, and temp provides taxation to the city, state, and federal government. So when you circumvent that, and again, I'm going to be the lawyer now on the other side who says, oh, hold on. They'll pay taxes when April comes. That's that from a personal standpoint, they'll pay to the city, state, and government whatever they're supposed to. Well, 2 things. One, not the business in the same way is my answer there. And 2, on the individual basis, you're now telling the government, you'll get your money when we get to it, which is April, not in September of the previous year. Anytime you tell a government entity you can't have the money that you should have had until I tell you, they don't like that. And effectively, that's what we're telling them. So just, right, I hope that makes sense. Just try to think
Sure.
about the agencies that are involved here that are honestly looking for funds.
Mhm.
One of the things that I didn't mention here, Hannah, that I will, just in terms of the broader context, we really are dealing with some metropolitan areas that are still reeling from a significant hit due to the pandemic. We find ourselves excited in some industries to have remote workforce or even hybrid. But remember, that keeps foot traffic down for some businesses that are, in the area. It keeps some foot traffic down for public transit. I mean, so you're seeing some of these agencies struggle. And again, I'll give you, this is like the New York pick on time as well. New York now has enacted that if your business is based in New York, if your company is in New York and you hire a remote employee in California, any state really, but I'm just picking California, it's far away. Now, in your mind, you're like, well, I registered in California. That individual is paying their state tax, any local or jurisdiction tax, all that's happening in payroll. New York now has said, and it's on the books, everybody. New York has said, that's wonderful. Were it not for the company being located in New York, that person should be working in New York. So that employee will be paying both California state and New York state tax on payroll, both.
Gee.
And right. And so I already know that there's some people that are like, oh crap, messaging their payroll team to say, are we doing this? That's where we're at. And I bring that up just to say that context is really important because that's why this is a financial taxation related consideration. That's why it matters. We're watching jurisdictions suffer, right, with less taxation that they're leaning on.
So for the in-person scenario, if they shift their language to being the request that they come in when they can, like there's not as much
Yeah. Yeah.
guidelines
The
around like
office is
when the person
open.
needs to be there.
We would love to see you if ever you would want to use our facility. We're happy to have you here as part of our independent contractor network. I can let you know that Jim and Mary are usually here on Tuesdays and Thursdays. If ever that's helpful for you, that open-ended.
Great.
Yeah.
Great. Love
Yeah.
that clarification. That's great.
Um, I've mentioned already the job descriptions. I just want to make sure that I sort of hammer this home a little bit to say it is time to look at your job descriptions. It is time to look at those duties and responsibilities. No longer can you just lean on job titles. Just because you call someone a marketing manager and you say, well, we do that, John, because we know what you're talking about with that job duties test. And managers are exempt if they're in that kind of role where they're managing, they're exempt from being considered for overtime. And my response to you would be the government knows that trick as well. Just adding manager to the end of a title doesn't mean it's so. In fact, for most of it, they've got to be managing two people, not just one, two people. So if you have a marketing manager who's managing no one, and I have sat in these depositions where someone says, yes, but they're managing their work. So does a bartender. But we don't call every bartender a bartender manager or a server manager, right? It's about people and at least two. So again, this is where the job description review with a practitioner who knows what to look for and to help you and kind of cultivate this a little bit differently, please use those resources. The other thing I'll mention is, to exactly Hannah's point, as we get into this budget season, this is a great time, both because of the legislative changes that are coming and for uniformity in approach to what a role is worth. Salary bands, it's time to look, what does the research tell us? What is this role worth in the marketplace? What are new hires getting when they're walking into a company? Where does that put us, both from a competitive standpoint, but now you also have the other piece of from a compliance standpoint. Let's make sure that we're operating in a framework. We have more and more jurisdictions that require you when you're posting a job to put the salary range up on it. And if you say to me, well, John, our company's located in a state that doesn't require it. If you're putting that thing on Indeed, you are not covered because you say, please, if you live in California, don't apply. That's not going to cover you, right? It's a national. And quite frankly, the first question that a candidate asks when they talk to your manager or screener is, what does the role pay? They're going to ask it anyway. So just get it together and confidently put it out there. This is a great time to do it as a result of this legislation change.
And this can be a
I'm
big
sorry.
project. This is something that I've helped
Yes.
multiple clients with in terms
Yes.
of providing some insight based on just the oversight that we have across some of the industry. So this can be a big project. So don't hesitate to reach out for help and take it on, because it can be an administrative burden to try to get this done, especially before the end of the year when we start to see these big changes happen.
100%. And it's a good time to do it now because the second quarter, first half of the year coming into this quarter, that data has been reported. And so you've got the most up-to-date salary research that's out there right now. Listen, Human Resource site is here. The email address is there. Please feel free to reach out if we can be helpful as well. Hopefully this kind of got you thinking through specifics for your own organizations, and hopefully answering some of those questions has been helpful for folks here as well. So thanks, Hannah, for letting me chat with you about this.
Yes, of course. Thank you so much for being here. This was such a great conversation. So yeah, obviously, if y'all are watching the replay back and have questions, you see that John's information here is on the screen. So definitely reach out to him to get those questions answered. So I appreciate y'all spending an hour out of your day with us. This was great. I feel way more informed about this topic than I did coming in here. I feel not just dangerous about it, I feel confident about it now. So you shifted that for me, and I appreciate that very, very much. For those listening now or watching the replay, we do have a free resource that we want to hook you up with. It is a dynamic forecasting guide. This can also help you in your budgetary journey as you're starting that in the next quarter. So you can scan this QR code. Again, you're going to get these slides in an email in a few days. So don't worry about it if you can't grab it right now. We'd also love for you to subscribe to our newsletter, where we just send industry updates, things that are going on. And this is a really cool place to stay connected to the information. So you can scan that code and get on our email news list. You can also keep listening to these topics just like this on the Creative Agency Success Show. So we'd love for you to subscribe to that. And then, of course, if you feel like, hey, like I've heard a lot and I feel like I need some help with this, it's time to explore what that looks like. You can certainly schedule that free consultation with us by scanning the QR code or going to our website. So, John, thanks again. It was such a pleasure, and I look forward to more conversations like this with you.
Thanks, Hannah. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much. Bye, y'all.